We start at the White House with this. President Trump possibly signing an executive order that could completely upend the Department of Education. Earlier this week, Department of Education Secretary Linda McMahon foreshadowed the move in an email titled "Our Department's Final Mission." That email said this restoration will profoundly affect staff, budgets, and agency operations. It went on to say they will eliminate unnecessary bureaucracy so that our colleges, K through 12 schools, students, and teachers can innovate and thrive. Let's take a closer look at what this could mean for the 26 million kids living in poverty, the 7.5 million students with disabilities, and 10 million who need financial aid to attend college or pursue a trade. The Department of Education gives $18.4 billion to programs that fund high poverty K through 12 schools, $15.5 billion to cover education for children with disabilities, and $1.6 trillion for federal student loan programs. The reaction to this is pouring in. American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten says the decision sends a message that the president, quote, doesn't care about opportunity for all kids, and cautions the administration not to use a, quote, war on woke to attack children. Meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson had this to say. Listen.
I haven't seen the details of it yet, but it's something that's been talked about for quite some time. And look, I think everybody around the country probably welcomes that, except some of the big teachers unions, because we don't need all these federal mandates sent down to the states. The education should be local. The more local, the better. You need parents and local school boards and superintendents to make the big decisions. And if you push that authority back down to the states, then that's what will happen. And so we expect that would be a great innovation for education across the board.
CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi is in Washington, and she joins us now. Olivia, thank you for being with us once again today. What would this look like for the more than 100 million K through 12 and college students in the United States right now?
Well, Mugo, it's a great question because a lot of people wonder what the Department of Education actually does, and it's pretty straightforward. This is a relatively small department. It's about 4,000 people, and the lion's share of work that they do is related to that federal financial aid. Of course, there's some work they do helping students with disabilities, providing guidelines for best teaching practices, not necessarily mandating what should be taught, but just for teachers from that perspective, best guidelines. But the majority of what they do is distribute financial aid. Just to give you a scale of how many college students are on federal financial aid, it's about 10 million. And there are only about 15 million students that are in colleges. It raises a little bit to about 18 million when you factor in graduate schools and vocational schools. But that's a big number of those students who are in college who are receiving federal financial aid. These come in the form of loans, Pell Grants, and the Department of Education is really in charge of distributing those funds. So if you're a student in college, if you're paying off your financial aid, this is something you're going to want to know about because it certainly might impact you. And Mugo, just to give you the context of it, people who have been receiving federal student loans have been in a bit of a seesaw back and forth about these loans for about 5 years now. Payments were paused during the COVID pandemic. That was under the Trump administration. The pause continued under the Biden administration. Then, of course, Biden tried to eliminate all student federal debt. That went to the Supreme Court. They struck that down. He kept trying to eliminate that debt, even though the Supreme Court said he couldn't. So a lot of back and forth here. If you are a student, these loans, who are paying off these loans, this move may impact you.
And clearly, this is a lot of people that will be affected by this. We're talking students, we're talking schools, a lot of confusion already, and now we're adding more uncertainty and confusion to the mix. The president would need 60 votes in the Senate to do this legislatively. How likely is this to actually happen?
Well, we know this might come in the form of an executive order, but I do want to note that Caroline Leavitt, who's the White House press secretary, just said that this executive order would not be signed today. That mirrors our own reporting. We know that there's a draft of this order, but that it won't be signed potentially today. Trump later today is going to sign some executive orders around sometime in the afternoon. But essentially, this mimics kind of what we've seen with a lot of the big moves coming from this administration. They float it There is a draft of something they would like to do that's seen as a big movement, something that would change how the federal government works. It gets floated, it gets reported on. Then they say they're not going to sign it, perhaps, reword it, rework it a bit, and then ultimately it gets signed anyway. But I do want to note, dismantling the Department of Education was so central to Trump's campaign. He talked about it all the time at various rallies. So it's not exactly something new that he's proposing here. It's something that Republicans have been trying to do since the inception of the Department of Education back in 1980. But as you mentioned, it was an act of Congress that made this department. It's an act of Congress needed to dismantle this department. So of course, any action today or later on dismantling the Department of Education through an executive order would certainly go to the courts, but this comes as the Trump administration really has been pushing executive power further and fighting out in the courts to really expand the power of the executive branch. It's something we've seen before. It's part of the playbook this administration has been using. Something to watch in the coming days, whether or not this executive order that they said that Trump has promised he would do would ultimately get signed.
We know you'll keep an eye on that for us. Olivia Rinaldi, thank you so much for your time today.